Just minutes ago, reports surfaced that Bryce Johnson, a central figure on Expedition Bigfoot, has been hospitalized. No official explanation, no clear timeline. Just a sudden halt in activity and an unusual silence from those closest to the situation. This didn't follow the pattern of a routine injury or exhaustion. It happened quietly, behind the scenes, after recent fieldwork in some of the most remote and punishing locations the show has ever explored. As questions spread faster than answers, one thing became clear. Something went wrong. And whatever it was, no one seems ready to talk about it yet. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come from a press release or an announcement. It came from absence. Bryce Johnson is known for consistency, scheduled appearances, active communication, steady involvement in ongoing projects. Then, without warning, that pattern broke. Planned engagements were quietly removed. Travel plans were halted. Communications that were normally routine simply stopped. At first, it didn't raise alarms. People close to the production are used to long gaps. Remote fieldwork often means delayed updates, but this time felt different. The silence wasn't explained. It wasn't acknowledged. It just appeared. Within hours, quiet adjustments were being made behind the scenes. Internal schedules were paused. Coordination emails stopped mid-thread. One crew member, speaking cautiously, later described it as an abrupt "stand down," a phrase typically reserved for situations where something has gone seriously off course. What made this moment unsettling wasn't panic, it was control. Information didn't leak the way it usually does. There were no offhand comments, no vague reassurances, no "everything's fine" placeholders. Instead, there was a tightening, fewer people involved, fewer details shared, a noticeable shift from openness to containment. Viewers noticed it too. Fans who tracked the show closely began asking questions when expected updates never arrived. Social channels went quiet. Mentions were avoided rather than addressed. Even neutral acknowledgments were missing. That's when the word "hospitalized" began circulating. Not publicly at first, but quietly, through secondary sources and industry whispers. No details, no context, just the implication that whatever happened required immediate medical attention and a level of seriousness that couldn't be brushed aside. Crucially, no one rushed to clarify it. In situations like this, production teams usually move fast to calm speculation. A short statement, a simple explanation, anything to reassure the audience. But that didn't happen here, and the longer the silence stretched, the more it suggested that answers weren't being withheld for dramatic effect, but because they weren't settled yet. This wasn't a public emergency. It was a private one. And that distinction matters, because when activity stops this suddenly, without explanation, it usually means the people involved are still trying to understand exactly what they're dealing with themselves. Whatever happened to Bryce Johnson didn't unfold on camera. It didn't come with a clear narrative or a prepared response. It interrupted everything mid-motion. And that interruption is where this story truly begins. As concern grew, attention turned to Bryce Johnson's last confirmed movements. Not rumors, not online speculation, just what could be reliably traced. And once that timeline was laid out, it raised more questions than it answered. In the days leading up to the incident, Bryce was actively involved in field operations connected to Expedition Bigfoot. These weren't brief shoots or controlled environments. They were extended deployments in remote terrain, areas chosen specifically because of isolation, limited access, and low human presence. In places like that, help isn't minutes away. Extraction itself becomes a challenge. Those familiar with the production describe the workload as intense but familiar. Long nights, disrupted sleep cycles, cold exposure, uneven ground, physical strain layered on top of mental fatigue. None of that is unusual for the show. Bryce has handled these conditions many times before without issue. That's what makes this situation stand out. By all outward signs, Bryce completed the final field window without interruption. He wasn't pulled early. He wasn't sidelined mid-operation. There were no public signs of injury, illness, or distress. No visible incident that would explain an immediate medical emergency. Then the timeline stops. At a very specific point, scheduled travel was canceled. Follow-up coordination halted. Communication chains went quiet, not delayed, ended. People who expected routine post-field updates never received them. That abrupt cutoff matters. It suggests whatever occurred did not develop slowly. It wasn't a condition that worsened over days with warning signs others could observe. It appears to have escalated fast enough to override standard procedures. Another detail complicates things further. Bryce is experienced in managing physical limits under pressure. For someone with that background to require hospitalization suggests this wasn't a simple case of exhaustion or discomfort. What exactly changed during that final stretch remains unclear, but when a timeline breaks this cleanly, it usually means the event behind it didn't allow time for gradual response. It forced an immediate one, and that unanswered gap between everything normal and everything stop is where the most unsettling questions now sit. To understand why Bryce Johnson's hospitalization caused such immediate concern, it's important to look at the environment he was operating in, one viewers never fully see. Expedition Bigfoot doesn't film under controlled conditions. It functions inside high-pressure field windows where time, weather, and logistics dictate everything. These investigations are built around sustained stress. Night operations disrupt natural sleep cycles. Physical exertion stacks day after day. Cold, damp terrain taxes the body in ways that don't always register immediately. Meals are rushed. Hydration becomes inconsistent. Recovery is often postponed in favor of momentum. What makes this significant is Bryce's role within that system. He isn't just another participant. He's expected to remain steady, capable, and reliable no matter the conditions. People in that position tend to internalize strain rather than broadcast it. Warning signs are minimized. Discomfort becomes background noise. Crews familiar with long-term field production describe an unspoken culture. You push through unless something is clearly wrong. Minor symptoms are ignored. Fatigue is normalized. Everyone assumes they'll recover once the window closes. But sometimes, the body doesn't wait. What unsettled those close to the situation wasn't just that Bryce needed medical attention, it was how fast everything changed. In routine health issues, productions adapt. Someone steps back. Schedules shift. Explanations circulate internally. That didn't happen here. Instead, operations stop abruptly. Communication narrowed. Decisions were handled by a small circle. That kind of response usually means uncertainty, not just about severity, but about cause. Production teams are trained to handle accidents. What they struggle with are situations that don't fit known patterns, when symptoms don't align cleanly, when timelines don't explain themselves. And that's where this becomes disturbing, because this wasn't treated like a known risk being managed. It was treated like something unexpected, something that forced everyone involved to pause and reassess before moving forward. When people accustomed to operating under constant pressure decide to stop completely, it's usually because that pressure crossed a line no one anticipated. What pushed concern into something darker wasn't just the hospitalization itself, it was how it was handled. When someone connected to a production experiences a routine medical issue, there's usually a familiar pattern. A brief delay, a vague update, a line about precautionary care, enough information to steady nerves without exposing details. That pattern didn't appear here. Instead, the response was immediate and unusually contained. Bryce wasn't treated locally and released. He wasn't cleared with a short observation window. Medical transport was escalated quickly, and access narrowed just as fast. People who would normally be informed weren't. Even internal updates became limited, carefully worded, and infrequent. That raised quiet alarm bells. Medical professionals familiar with field operations note that this kind of response usually signals uncertainty, not panic, but caution. Situations where doctors don't yet know what they're dealing with, or where symptoms don't point cleanly in one direction. In those cases, the priority becomes monitoring, isolation, and time. Another detail stood out. No one rushed to label the situation. There was no mention of injury, no reference to dehydration, exhaustion, or exposure. Even general categories were avoided. avoided. That absence is telling. When a condition is understood, even broadly, it's usually named. When it isn't, silence becomes the safest option. Meanwhile, production didn't resume around the situation. It didn't adapt, it stopped. That suggests the hospitalization wasn't seen as a side event. It was central enough to affect everything else. People close to the situation describe a waiting period, not a countdown to recovery, but a pause while information came in. Tests, observations, follow-ups, the kind of process that doesn't resolve in hours. What unsettled observers most was how carefully the situation was being protected from speculation. Not denied, not clarified, just held. That's not how minor incidents are handled. It's how situations are managed, when outcomes aren't yet clear, and saying the wrong thing could cause more harm than saying nothing at all. At this point, the concern wasn't about what had already happened. It was about what doctors were still trying to rule out. By this point, the question wasn't just what happened to Bryce Johnson. It was why this situation felt fundamentally different from every other onset injury or health scare people could remember. Productions like Expedition Bigfoot have dealt with sprains, infections, exhaustion, even emergency evacuations before. Those incidents followed a recognizable rhythm. This one didn't. Normally, when something goes wrong, information leaks fast. Not maliciously, but organically. Someone mentions a heat issue. Someone else confirms it was precautionary. The story stabilizes. That never happened here. Instead, the narrative fractured. Small pieces surfaced, but they didn't connect. Each new detail raised more questions than it answered. Another difference was the speed of escalation. There was no visible intermediate stage, no public moment of concern followed by action. It went from normal operations to full stop almost overnight. That kind of jump suggests the problem wasn't something building gradually in plain sight. It suggests a turning point, an event or realization that forced an immediate change in posture. People who've worked in high-risk field environments point out that when leadership is affected, the response is magnified. Bryce isn't just a participant. He's a stabilizing presence. If he's sidelined, everything else becomes uncertain. But even accounting for that, the degree of containment here stood out. Then there's the language that wasn't used. No reassurance, no timeline, no framing of recovery. Even neutral phrases like "out of an abundance of caution" were absent. That omission carries weight. It implies no one was ready to predict what came next. This wasn't handled like an incident with a clear path forward. It was handled like an open question. And that's what unsettled those paying close attention. The sense that the situation was still unfolding, still being assessed, and not yet safe to explain. In environments built around certainty and control, ambiguity is the most uncomfortable state of all. At this stage, concern shifted from curiosity to something heavier. Not fear, but vigilance. Because when experienced teams slow everything down this deliberately, it's usually because the unknown is more dangerous than the known. And whatever caused Bryce Johnson's hospitalization hadn't finished revealing itself yet. As days passed, another detail became impossible to ignore. The people closest to Bryce Johnson went quiet, not just publicly, but almost entirely. Cast members who normally interact freely with fans posted nothing. Production channels stayed inactive. Even indirect acknowledgments were noticeably absent. This wasn't normal. In most situations, someone eventually breaks the silence. A short message, a supportive comment, a reassurance that things are under control. Here, that never came. Instead, there was restraint, careful distance, the kind of silence that suggests coordination rather than coincidence. Those familiar with production environments recognize this pattern. When something is still being evaluated, medically, legally, or operationally, communication tightens. Not because people don't care, but because saying the wrong thing too early can create problems that can't be undone. What made this especially unsettling was how unified the silence appeared. No conflicting messages, no accidental disclosures, no emotional posts made in haste. Everyone seemed to understand, without being told publicly, that this was not the moment to speak. Behind the scenes, this kind of quiet usually means one thing: people are waiting. waiting on test results, waiting on clear answers, waiting to know whether a situation is resolving or changing. Another detail stood out. Production didn't begin pivoting around Bryce's absence. There were no announcements about schedule adjustments or replacements, no attempts to normalize the interruption. Everything stayed frozen, as if the outcome of one situation would determine what happened next for everyone else. That kind of pause is rare. It suggests that Bryce's condition wasn't being treated as an isolated issue, but as something with broader implications, something that needed clarity before any forward movement could safely occur. For viewers, silence often feels frustrating, but for professionals, silence is sometimes the loudest signal of all. It means uncertainty still outweighs confidence. It means decisions haven't been finalized. And most importantly, it means the story isn't finished yet. At this point, the absence of information wasn't calming nerves. It was sharpening them, because when an entire team chooses not to speak, it's usually because they don't yet know which version of the truth they'll be allowed or able to share. As silence stretched on, speculation rushed in to fill the void. Online forums, comment sections, and private messages began circulating theory, some mild, some extreme. But what stood out wasn't the rumors themselves. It was how firmly no one close to the situation engaged with them. Usually, false narratives are corrected quickly. Even a vague denial can shut down dangerous speculation. That didn't happen here. Instead, the response was consistent, non-response. No clarifications, no course corrections, just a firm boundary that no one appeared willing to cross. This matters because professionals don't ignore misinformation unless there's a reason. And often, that reason is uncertainty. When facts are still being established, addressing speculation can lock people into statements they may later need to walk back. People familiar with crisis communication note that this kind of restraint often accompanies internal restrictions, legal considerations, medical privacy, contractual obligation, or active review processes, where information is still considered provisional. Another unsettling factor was the absence of even supportive language. No thoughts are with him. No hoping for a quick recovery. Those messages are common, even when details are limited. Their absence suggests that outcomes were still being evaluated and that optimism at that stage may have been premature. Meanwhile, fan speculation escalated precisely because there was nothing to anchor it. Each unanswered question created space for another theory. But through it all, one thing remained consistent. The people who actually knew more said nothing. That silence doesn't confirm anything sinister, but it does indicate that the situation hadn't reached a stable point. And in high-profile environments, stability is usually the threshold for communication. Until that threshold is reached, rumors remain rumors, but the refusal to engage with them tells its own story. It suggests the line between what's known and what's still unfolding hadn't been drawn yet. And when that line hasn't been drawn, it's often because the picture isn't complete. At this stage, the most disturbing element wasn't any single theory. It was the fact that no one was ready to say which theories were wrong. As the situation surrounding Bryce Johnson remained unresolved, attention shifted from what had happened to what might follow. Not just for him, but for everyone connected to Expedition Bigfoot. Incidents like this don't exist in isolation. They ripple outward, forcing difficult conversations behind closed doors. If the hospitalization was linked in any way to field conditions, it raises immediate questions about risk thresholds. How far can investigations push into remote, high-stress environments before the danger outweighs the discovery? And who decides when that line has been crossed? Production teams are built around contingency plans, but they rely on predictability. What unsettles professionals most is the unknown, situations that don't fit established categories. When that happens, protocols are re-evaluated, sometimes rewritten entirely. Another implication lies in timing. If updates are delayed until clarity is achieved, it suggests that whatever doctors are monitoring hasn't resolved cleanly. Recovery timelines aren't being shared because they aren't certain yet. That uncertainty affects scheduling, future field work, work, and even how upcoming episodes are framed. There's also the human cost. High-risk research environments demand trust. Trust that safety measures work. Trust that limits are respected. When something disrupts that trust, even temporarily, it leaves a mark. People begin asking quieter questions, not about ratings or storylines, but about sustainability. For viewers, the lack of closure feels unsettling. For those involved, it's heavier, because moving forward without understanding what went wrong risks repeating it. At this point, whatever happened has already changed the trajectory of the investigation. The only question left is how much. As of now, there is still no complete explanation for what led to Bryce Johnson's hospitalization. No clear cause, no confirmed timeline of recovery, just a careful, ongoing wait for answers that haven't been made public yet. What makes this moment linger isn't fear, it's uncertainty. The situation hasn't been closed. It hasn't been summarized. It hasn't been packaged into a narrative people can easily understand. And until it is, concern remains. For those watching from the outside, the instinct is to demand clarity. But in situations like this, clarity doesn't come on a schedule. It arrives only when enough is known to speak responsibly. Anything earlier risks doing more harm than good. What's clear is that this wasn't treated as a routine setback. It interrupted operations, reshaped plans, and placed everything else on hold. That alone signals its importance. There are still questions no one is answering publicly. Was this a medical issue that developed suddenly? Was it connected to prolonged exposure or accumulated strain? Or was it something entirely unrelated that simply happened at the worst possible moment? Until those questions are resolved, speculation will continue. But speculation isn't the point. The point is that something unexpected happened to someone deeply experienced in extreme conditions, and it forced everyone involved to stop and reassess. Sometimes the most disturbing stories aren't the ones filled with dramatic revelations. They're the ones still unfolding quietly, where the absence of information speaks louder than any statement could. And until that silence breaks, this story remains open.